Thank you for joining us. I'm Teresa Coffey-Gordon. I'm the director of the Innovations Fund at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and I'm also a fellow at Opus Faveo. Today, we're going to hear from several of the authors of the Innovation Impact Index, which is a study in collaboration between Opus Faveo and the Bush Institute. We believe that this is the most robust study yet to measure the impact of innovation with such rigor, and we're excited to share highlights with you today. It's my pleasure to be the moderator of today's session. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know to please feel free to send questions into the chat box, and we'll take them at the end of the session. The session should run about an hour and 15 minutes. It will be recorded, and we will send the session out to you after the fact. And in the chat room, in case you wanted to see it, is the full report. So you can actually look at that as the authors are discussing it. And at this point, it's my pleasure to open the floor to our authors and let them introduce themselves to you, and we'll get started. So Colin, why don't you start? Colin Clark from the Bush Institute.
Of course. Thank you, Teresa, and welcome to everybody on the call from here in Boston on a steamy July day. So I'm Vineet Nijhawan. Some of you on the call may know me from the time I was leading the Boston University Tech Transfer Office. But prior to that, I started my first tech company when I was an engineering student, and subsequently my startups were acquired by Boeing, Motorola, Qualcomm, Mitel. And about 13 years ago, I decided that I didn't want to be a parent running companies anymore, but be more of a grandparent, help others. And I do that by teaching. So I teach at Boston University, and I have been teaching entrepreneurship there for the past 13 years. And I ran the tech transfer office at BU for 5.5 years. We ended up launching 8 venture-backed companies that have raised over $350 million. And I figured if it works there, it's got to work other places. So now I'm the managing director of the Massachusetts Tech Transfer Center, and we're focused on academic spin-outs from all 34 Massachusetts research institutions. And I guess we'll get into, Teresa, how we got together, but that's my background.
That's great, Vineet. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry about my, somehow I was put into mute. I don't understand it. But anyhow, it's a pleasure to have everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Colin Clark. I am an economist. I was in the investment world for about 25 years and have now been for the last 2 years and change at the George W. Bush Institute. Quick background, the Bush Institute is part of the George W. Bush Presidential Center, which also includes the President Bush's Museum and Library. When he left office, President Bush wanted to have a think tank that would also be, in his words, a do tank. That's what the Bush Institute is. I'm a director in our economic policy program. We're very focused on the overall challenge of improving economic growth, opportunity, upward mobility in America, both through domestic and international policies. I focus mostly on the domestic side. What brings us to this project and got us really excited about working on it is we're all about growth and prosperity in the economy and in particular places, and we recognize just how very important university research is to those things. So we really look forward to talking about that today. Christian?
Okay, thanks everyone. My name is Christian Blackwell, and I'm managing partner at Opus Faveo. I'll do a couple words on my own background, and then talk a minute about Opus Faveo, and then segue into how we got started on this project. So I've been in the startup world for about 15 years. Before that, I was a specialist in highly complex, cross-border, very large transactions in infrastructure and other things, privatizations, large financings, et cetera. And did a lot of project finance, which in a way is sort of a kind of startup financing, but these are very large projects in the billions of dollars for, again, things like infrastructure projects, but they are sort of startup related. And the other thing I'll mention is that much of my background is in policy issues. So these kinds of transactions that were the highlight of the first part of my career, all related to different countries and managing things like political risk in emerging markets and frontier markets. So I come from a background of thinking about policy issues, which I think is relevant here. Opus Faveo is a firm based in Dallas, which is where I am currently. And we primarily are a venture development firm. We've been around for quite some time building companies. But because of the backgrounds of our partners, we've gotten involved in a lot of conversations, very interesting conversations, possibly some of you who are in the webinar today. But a lot of university leaders, political leaders, private sector leaders talking about efforts to foster innovation across the United States, in other countries, and with different kinds of agencies. And that theme has really interested us. So for years, we've invested time and money into various research projects looking at this question of how do entities foster innovation, what are they trying to achieve, and kind of related issues. So these are themes that have long interested us. We did a ranking similar to this a number of years ago, and we've done survey work. Some of you may have been involved in some of our survey work, looking at things like tech transfer in the university space. We referenced that in the paper. And several years ago, Colin and I started talking about how we might be able to collaborate. We knew that we wanted to get a lot more rigorous in what we had done in our first ranking, and bring this kind of econometric perspective to the analysis. As you'll see, Colin is very analytical and rigorous, and he's a terrific partner, and the Bush Institute has been as well for us. And so it's been a great collaboration and a couple of years of work to get to this point. So we're pretty excited about the results, and we think that it moves things along pretty nicely in terms of kind of the literature that's out there. The other thing I want to mention is just this concept of innovation impact. So when you look at this report and you look at the ranking, and as you think about it, remember that we started out with this concept of how do entities foster innovation. Quickly, that gets you to what is innovation, and of course there are many, many answers to that. But as we spoke to people like you in various places, we kept coming back to what is the goal of all of these efforts. And we took one cliche, innovation, and realized that you had to add another one there, which is impact. And we think it actually, yes, it sounds a little bit like a cliche, but we think it's actually very meaningful. And our takeaway in conversations with university leaders is that we have to think about what is the impact we're trying to achieve. And then this index is really a way to try to measure that impact. And we, again, think it does a nice job of that. We certainly see improvements, and we'd love to be able to do it again, renew it, and make it better still. But we think it certainly advances, as I said, what's out there, what's been published before and what's out there, and goes a long way to trying to measure that impact. I think now, Colin, it may be good for you to talk a little bit about kind of strengths and challenges of universities and how that what our takeaways have been in that realm.
Yeah, what initially attracted us to the whole, me personally, and then the Bush Institute getting involved after I joined. First of all, I think is really a love and a passion for the mission of universities. I should have mentioned before, I am an adjunct professor at SMU in the Department of Economics, and have long just kind of loved the university world. But as an economist, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the role of universities. Universities typically have this pretty straightforward two-part mission, teaching and research. But we all know the economy has been changing all around us in a more knowledge-centric fashion, in which the teaching mission and the research mission have continued to evolve, really in response to the way the wider world has evolved. So really two quick observations that get me that got me excited about the project, and I think I hope that we'll convey to the group and whoever will listen in the times to come. One is that the university's role, particularly relatively large research-oriented universities and other research institutions, their role in driving forward technological change, progress, and economic growth in the economy is more important than it's ever been. What we find is essentially over the long term, what economists usually agree on is that economic growth and rising living standards more or less are, they're joined at the hip with technological progress. But we also know technological progress largely comes from purposeful, intentional research and development activity. And we know that as a percentage of all the research and development activity that goes on, universities have played a larger role quantitatively, qualitatively. They occupy a really important position in the ecosystem of innovation. And that's more the case than ever as the economy grows ever less focused on tangible physical capital and ever more focused on intellectual capital. So they're really important. That's the first point. But the second point is universities are challenged on many fronts. One simple problem is that a whole lot of the public, I think, doesn't fully understand or doesn't fully support the modern mission of universities. So one thing we all need to do, those of us who are authors of this report, and I suggest everyone who cares about the long-term well-being of universities, is to help to convey better to the public at large how important this role is, the traditional teaching role, as well as the evolving research role. So that's one thing, is just it gets alarming to me when we see surveys that ask people their confidence level and all different kinds of institutions, you know, the police, Congress, and so on, the military, and so on. And universities don't rank very high, and they should be close to the top. So that's an issue. Universities are financially challenged, and I don't have to tell anyone on the call about that. That's a giant issue. We can talk more about that later if you all want. We happen to think that the universities that are best positioned to surmount the financial challenges that the whole sector faces will be ones that score high for innovation impact for a wide variety of reasons that we can develop. And then in one other respect, we all know, all of us who love the university world and maybe appreciate its quirkiness will understand that these are oftentimes institutions where there's all kinds of great work going on, including work that has a very high degree of, you could say, innovation impact, to use our term. And yet it's a whole lot of lone wolves. It's a lot of talented people all kind of doing their thing. And oftentimes much of the university doesn't even know what it has in-house, much less being sort of organized to move that to the outside world and maximize its impact on the world. So that's just sort of goes with the territory. I don't think that's going to be completely changed anytime soon. But one of our basic messages would be that universities typically have more than they think they have in the way of innovative research going on. And generally speaking, they almost across the board have considerable ways to improve in terms of making that research more impactful on the wider society, the wider economy. So that's why we really wanted to study this.
And I'd like to just chime in on that, Colin. I think one of our takeaways, both at Opus Faveo from all of the work we've done in venture development, in the many conversations, focus groups, et cetera, that we've done over the years with university leaders, but certainly this research again points out that there are so many incredible institutions. The universities in this report are all amazing places. And so when we look at the ranking, what we see at Opus Faveo is an opportunity. If you're not number one, there's an opportunity. It doesn't mean that you're not doing something right. It means that there's an opportunity to take something great and make it better still. And as people who are really interested in economic development, in universities as engines for all of that, that's pretty exciting. So,
yeah, can I add one other thought on that as well? I said when I introduced myself that at the Bush Institute, we are extremely interested in the challenge of improving opportunity and upward mobility in the economy. Now, I think most universities would generally believe that they're on the right side of that, in the sense that an education is clearly a path to upward mobility in the economy. I think that we would want to convey an additional message here, and that is that universities that have high innovation impact have high economic impact beyond their walls. That creates opportunities. That makes the cities that they are a part of and the wider economy more prosperous with more opportunity in it. It's sort of a simple point, but so many people don't understand that these days that we kind of feel like there's a place to get on a soapbox and sort of emphasize it.
And it's societal
Yeah,
impact
and I think,
too, right? Go ahead, Vineet.
You know, so you know, I'm a practitioner, and when I met Christian many years ago, you know, we sort of got along well in this big picture thinking. So, but coming down to the practitioner level of, you know, how can we actually change practices, right, was very important to me. So when we conducted this study, it was really important to me that we not only looked at the big picture and what impact it would have from an outcome perspective, but provide details so that universities could find a way to go from being ranked in the bottom quartile to, you know, moving up a quartile. And I know we're going to get into it some more, but I wanted to add that yes, the big picture is very important here in what we've done, but so is the practitioner part of it.
I think the need to follow up with that, it would be helpful to talk a little bit about the study and the analytical rigor that was taken to conduct the study.
Yeah, so I think most people on this webinar know that there are other rankings that have been done. Probably the one that is closest to what we're doing is the Milken ranking, which I don't think they've updated in a couple of years. Now, most of those rankings have used one set of data, and that is the autumn licensing data, which is self-reported by universities. We felt that the autumn data was important, but that there were other sources of data that would be important to also include in our analysis. And of course, recruiting Colin to the team and then his students has been the key, because they're really the economists who were able to take this woolly-eyed thinking that we had and sort of turn it into something that was defensible and you know, very rigorous. So I think, Colin, you can talk about, you know, how many dependent variables we looked at, different data sets, and you know, all the different methodologies, statistical methodologies we played around with. I mean, we spent 2 years on this, and with considerable rigor, wouldn't you say?
Couldn't agree more. Yes, absolutely. Shall we get into it a little bit about what we?
Yeah, I do. Before we do that, I just want to chime in because we neglected to do that at the beginning. You've got several of the authors here with you today, but I do want to just call out again a couple of the other authors who are not on the webinar presenting today. Christina Murray, an economist who was just terrific in doing a lot of the heavy lifting econometric work and statistical work. Steve Ingram from Opus Faveo, who again was just a big part of the analytical and research work. And then finally, and most importantly, David Overton from Opus Faveo, who really led a big part of the analysis and what we call the quartile analysis that we'll get into here in a little bit as well. So I just wanted to call all of them out and thank them for their hard work on this.
It's great.
Shall we, Teresa, shall we maybe get into kind of what we've done and our results here?
That would be fantastic, Colin.
We'll be very, try to be as concise as possible to summarize 2 years of intensive work, and I hope that people will, you know, will have some questions or comments. So we do start in an area that does have some existing literature. I will refer to certain things along the way here, but let me just be, first of all, clear about essentially what we have done in this report. We really did 2 things. Number one, we've created a set of rankings Okay, more on that in a moment. And for innovation impact and for what we call innovation impact productivity. And number two, we have analyzed through a variety of statistical quantitative approaches, we've analyzed factors that make some institutions more productive than others in converting research inputs, measured by research dollars, into outputs, into what we call innovation impact. So we do those two things. Let me talk about both of them, okay? First of all, with the rankings, as Vineet noted, there are several sets, three that we discuss in the report, 3 sets of existing rankings. I agree, the Michael Milken Institute one is the one that we're closest to, and I think that's a terrific job that we've learned a lot from. Hopefully we're adding to that literature here, and a couple other efforts. The one thing we do, there's 2 respects in which we've done something different, and we think adds some we hope considerable value in these rankings. One thing that we have done is we have taken a broader definition of what constitutes innovation impact. Now, I'll talk about the individual variables in a moment, but what has been typical in this literature and is the case with the very, very well done Milken rankings is to focus, as Vineet said, on variables that are in the data set operated by the Association of University Technology Managers, AUTM. Essentially, those variables all relate to activities that are typically close to the technology transfer function of an institution, activities like patenting, licensing, and creating spin-out or startup companies. We agree those things are really important. We think that the typical large research institution views its innovation impact mission somewhat more broadly, includes a broader research component where the impact of a university's research on the wider world isn't only through the companies that are formed or the technology, the licenses that are signed, but also is through things like how their research is cited in patents or research by other people. So we'll talk about the variables in a moment. We also think the teaching component is really important, creating the STEM innovators, engineers, practitioners, doers of the future. And we think the typical university leadership would view it that way as well. So we've taken a broader definition, which I'll explain in detail in a moment, and then created a composite score for every university in terms of innovation impact using this broader measure than has ever been used in the literature. That's one thing we do. Mm-hmm. A second thing we do that is new here is we explicitly separate innovation impact, which in economic terms you could think of as the output of this process, from innovation impact productivity, which is about the efficiency, if you will, the productivity of turning inputs into outputs. And that's pretty important because that basically says a relatively small institution could actually be really, really productive. I mean, right. It's sort of a simple point, but if you are scoring universities in significant part on just the total output, then an institution like the entire University of California system, which spends $5 billion a year on research, is necessarily going to score a lot higher on just about any absolute output measure than, say, a university that, like my own, SMU, that spends about $30 million a year. Essentially an output score from the productivity score. So that's what we do in terms of the rankings. Now let me say a little bit about how we did it. We examined all kinds of variables and what the available data was and so on. This, by the way, is not a world where there is just loads of perfect data, to be honest. I think AUTM has really useful fields, really important fields within the category that it's serving. Obviously, always a challenge to get every university to report in exactly the same way. No easy matter. My hat's off to the AUTM folks who wrestle with that. The other areas are even less standardized because there isn't an equivalent of AUTM or, for example, tabulating research impact. So we basically came up with 9 variables that we thought the data could adequately support in a comparable way across universities. 5 of them are from the AUTM data set. They relate to patenting, licensing, receiving license income on established licenses, and on creating new companies, spin-out companies, as we refer to them. 2 more variables related to what we call research impact. One of those is citations of work by a university's faculty and students, in some cases, by other academic papers, and the other is citations of the university's work in patents, even if the university itself doesn't have its name on the patent. And fortunately, there's a number of databases that measure those things pretty well. We actually relied on a simple to execute, but pretty good method, which was basically all about the Google Patents search engine and the general Google search engine, which measures citations and so forth. And then we also,
Google Scholar, actually, yeah, Google Scholar.
Sorry, I meant to say Google Scholar. Yeah. Google Patents and Google Scholar. Thanks for reminding me. And then we also, as regards what we called teaching impact, looked at STEM graduates. We did one variable that was STEM PhD graduates and one variable that was STEM bachelor's and master's graduates. The federal government keeps that data, as does the National Science Foundation in particular, and the Department of Education. So we put all those together. We created a composite score from these 9 variables. There were 195 institutions that it was necessary, obviously, that they report to Autumn. So for any universities out there that choose not to report to Autumn, there are a handful of relatively prominent ones. There was no way to include them. Where I went as an undergraduate, Yale University doesn't report. I'm sorry to say, they're not in the rankings, even though I'm sure they would rank decently high. So 195 for which we had all the Autumn variables that we needed, which is to say 5 variables. With all of those universities, it's no problem finding the other 4 variables. So we had 9 variables.
Colin, if I can interrupt for a second, because I think this is a good place to just mention, and it's a bit of a commercial. We weren't paid to give the commercial, but it's a commercial for Autumn. And that is that one takeaway is this data set is just really important to the country. We've actually had people reach out to us as a result of this report from other countries saying they would like to have an Autumn-like organization, or how can they get involved with Autumn in other countries outside the US and Canada, which are the 2 that report into Autumn. So certainly one takeaway here and one recommendation is universities should take Autumn seriously. They should take the reporting to Autumn seriously, and donors to universities, funders, sponsored research entities that sponsor research, and political leaders should all be encouraging universities to report to Autumn. It's a wonderful data set, and we'd love to see it expanded, and the consistency continue to be improved.
Absolutely, and I think to follow that up, Christian, I think the whole area that we're talking about here, which is in a sense the innovation impact output and productivity of the whole research institution sector is so important, and yet so not measured other than by Autumn, right? I mean, the fact that in a sense there are no government data sets. There are no data sets anywhere that actually routinely year after year bring together the paper citation and the patent citation. There are data sets that just do that, but not ones that do it at the university level in a consistent way year after year. This is an area we all need to do better, and we certainly need to internationalize it. Couldn't agree more with that. So we had 9 variables for 195 institutions. We combined them into a single composite score using a statistical method called principal component analysis, which is common in the economics and statistics literature. We thought that was superior to just a sort of a straight up average or straight up weighted average, because in ways we could talk about, in effect, it sort of lets the data tell us in effect what the weighting should be. So that created a composite score for each of the 9 universities measuring innovation impact. Just in absolute terms, clearly the big institutions tend to produce the most on average. We then also looked at productivity more than one way. I would say the most important way it was essentially to take our output measure and divide it by a simple measure of input, which is the total research spending as indicated in the Autumn data set, because that's a field that essentially all universities report to Autumn. We did do a couple other methods that all produced virtually the same results in terms of who's highly productive and who's less so. So there's some, what in economics we call robustness in the study, as we've looked at productivity 3 different ways with virtually the same results every time. The idea of looking at productivity is a novelty in the literature. I will say of the Milken rankings that they take it into consideration, but in a single composite score that has some productivity stuff in it, but also has absolute output rankings. So it's like I said, we think it's really good work. We've done something a little different. And what it does mean is a different set of institutions stand out because some cases rather small ones that could not possibly rank high in any other ranking turn out to be very, very productive under our method. So let me say a little bit about let me say what we did on the other side, and then I'll do results real fast. The other side of what we did is—
Can I just interrupt for a second and just that was a lot of information, and I'm sure people have questions. So I just want to remind people that if you do have questions, just enter them into the chat and we'll go along with that, and we'll answer them as we go. So thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
Sure. You know what? I think actually probably the best thing at this moment, our results are in the report. They're full tables showing lots of results including across multiple methods for all the universities in the data set. I urge you to look at it. I will just say, just to give you a flavor of it, but who scores very, very high. As we said, clearly the largest institutions with the biggest resources are going to tend to dominate in terms of the aggregate innovation impact. The California system, which reports like a lot of, not all, but like a lot of state public systems, reports to Autumn as a system. We cannot get data for individual campuses such as Berkeley or Davis or UCLA. The same goes for the University of Texas system, which is the second biggest in terms of research spending. Pretty well predictably, I would say, the California system, which has the biggest inputs, has the biggest outputs. The University of Texas system has the second biggest inputs. It scores second in outputs. Not that surprising. When you go below that, what you quickly find is, again, big spenders tend to produce high. MIT is third. Other very prominent private institutions that rank very high include Stanford, Northwestern, let's see, Johns Hopkins, and among public institutions, University of Washington, University of Minnesota, University of Florida, a couple more. The ranking's all there, and we absolutely would draw your attention to it. One thing that I think is notable is the top 25 or 30 spenders in terms of research spending are vastly larger in terms of input and output than most others. So we have a great many wonderful universities and colleges and research institutions in America, but it is notable that it is a relatively small number. If you wanted to get to like 50% of all the innovation impact, you only have to go down to about the top 30. That's kind of interesting, I think. Now let me say something about productivity, whereas as I noted, the small can do very, very well, right? We broke down our productivity rankings into several different buckets, large, medium, and small for sort of classic research universities that train undergraduates and graduate students and so forth, plus a category for pure medical institutions and another category for pure research institutions. And the report outlines what we mean by all of those, but we thought it was important to not compare apples to oranges. It's not, really obvious that if you're comparing, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute to Harvard, you're really comparing apples to apples. So anyway, what we find, just to talk about the research, the sort of traditional research universities, we do a large, medium, and small. It's important to note that small isn't that small in the grand scheme because they are reporting data to Autumn. They're already large institutions, just not as large. So among our large group, the top performing institution in productivity terms is the University of Florida, which was number 6 in terms of overall innovation output. The top in our so-called mid-size category, which is still pretty large, is Drexel University. And the top in our smaller category is Brigham Young University. Vineet's in a little bit going to talk about case studies we did on all three. We talked to the people who run technology transfer and to other people involved in the innovation ecosystem in each of those 3 institutions. So more on that in a moment. So that gives you some sense of the output. Also, just to give you some sense of the kind of the variation. When we say that some universities really are doing better than this at others, what I would tell you is in terms of the productivity scores, which are all in the report, even among the very large, what you would see, even though they're all relatively similar institutions that have pretty similar, organizations and business and so forth, that in terms of the output per dollar of research spending, that a high performer like the University of Florida or other relatively high performers is something on the order of 2 to 3 times, getting 2 to 3 times more per dollar than the average player, and probably 3 times larger than maybe a first quartile, like 25% from the bottom player, and that's just among the very large. So these differences are not small. That's one thing we want to convey. And the differences in the somewhat smaller categories are enormous. So in the case of like Brigham Young, which scores so high, the output per dollar would be something like 40 or 50 times a relatively lower, not the average, but maybe a first quartile kind of player, or a first quartile from the bottom. So the differences are absolutely enormous, even among the very large. Now, so that covers the first side, which is the rankings. Now, Christian, you want to jump in?
And I want to interject here something real quick, Colin, and that is, just looking at this is a fairly simple concept here, breaking the research universities into these 3 groups by research budget. But Colin said something which I wanted to call out, which is even with the smaller universities, these are large dollars. And those of you who are in the gears or leading universities, your research dollars. But what we have found is that stakeholders of various kinds don't know how big these dollars are. And might be afraid to tell them, maybe that's one thought, but I actually think it's a really positive story, which is these are big entities and they are incredibly important to the broader economy, to societal problems, not the least of which is solving the COVID crisis. And it's good for people to know that. So just the size of the research budget is a pretty amazing number for every university in our group.
We have gotten a couple of questions, and then I'll throw the questions out, and then I'd love to go to Vineet to have some information from you to give like a case study of some examples. But one of the questions that I think relates to what you were talking about, Colin, is what are some of the common traits of the worst performing universities? Is there anything that you would call out?
Well, we like to be upbeat people, and you could say the common characteristics of low performers are sort of the opposite of the ones that are high performers. So I kind of prefer to speak to it the latter way, but obviously it's sort of the same thing. And I saw one of the comments was saying I was being a little bit hard to follow, so I'm sorry about that. I hope I'm at least technically easy to follow, and I'll try to just be real clear. The second thing that we studied, which is the answer to that question, is what are the factors that predict that some universities will be very high performers and others will be relatively low performers in terms of getting a large bang for the buck in terms of their research spending, measured in terms of innovation impact. So what did we learn? We looked at a lot of variables, but you can say basically we looked at 4 categories of metrics and looked at which ones turn out to matter. Quite a few didn't matter, by the way, but we looked at ones which did, or we determined which ones did, I should say. The first one is just the size of the university as measured by its research spending and by other measures. And it turns out that if you want to predict the productivity of universities, that large size on average is the enemy of productivity. So the first answer, what predicts relatively low productivity? Not for all institutions, but on average, it would be being very large. So the small actually do quite well on average in terms of getting big bang for the buck. That should be encouraging, I hope, to the small institutions of the world. Why might that be? Just to speculate for a moment, one possibility is just that very large institutions maybe just, I don't know, have a lot of bureaucracy or something and just it's not as efficient. That's possible. I think another possibility, just knowing something about some of the large universities, it may be that very large institutions are the only ones who can take on the most complex problems, and those are inherently really, really costly. And on average, the return in terms of the patents and the licenses might be kind of smaller and yet very socially important long term. So we're very open to that possibility. Second category of possible explanations is about where the universities are located. Now, we do understand that that's not something universities can very easily change. Sometimes they partially change it by creating satellite campuses in different places. But what did we learn? We learned, in line with prior research, there have been other studies that found the same thing, that it helps to be in a big metro area. Big metro areas are just There are places where there's a lot of smart people and a lot of ideas bumping into each other more frequently, more companies around, and in general, it helps to be in a big city and big metro area. We also looked, though, at a variable that no one had ever looked at in the literature before. We also found that it helps to be in a metro area that has a relatively large immigrant population share, foreign-born population share.
Yes.
No one ever looked at that before. And of course, big cities tend to have relatively large population shares, but even once you control for population size, there are plenty of places that actually have smaller population, but high immigrant population shares. That tends to be a great college town. That tends to produce a really productive university. So about these metro area variables, clearly university presidents, vice presidents, and so forth can't change them very easily. They might think a little bit about the satellite campus idea, but we do have a message that extends beyond university leadership to the wider society, which is in general creating cities that are diverse in terms of their immigrant population, in terms of the talents that are all mixing and bumping into each other, is good for the economy. It's good for business. It's also good for the universities that are there. Third category.
So interesting and important. Brittany, before I pass it to you, I just want to thank, we have the current chair of Autumn on the phone, Dawn Tomlinson, and she wanted us to know that Autumn frequently works with other countries creating metric collection tools for them. So I just wanted to point that out. And Vineet, I'd love to pass it to you. There is a question that I think is related to that you could probably cover through your examples. And is it the view of the research team that institutions have a lot of influence over innovation productivity? So if you could maybe cover that in your example, that would be great.
And sorry, just
Yeah,
another quick note, just on the prior comment. Mark Sedum is the, and I hopefully I pronounced that correctly, is the chair of Autumn. Don is
the outgoing chair. No, Mark is the outgoing chair.
My apologies.
Yeah.
Thank you both for joining. Thank you.
Yeah. So, when we went through the analysis like Colin just described, and we got the ranking, we decided to do some qualitative analysis as well. And we spoke to, some of the universities in different size buckets who rated highly in productivity. And there were a few things that jumped out that were in common. So and between the big ones, the medium ones, and the small ones, one of the things that jumped out that we found was in common is that, when the leadership of the institutions were positively focused on research commercialization, then there was a high correlation between that and success in what they were doing. So that was one thing that we found sort of common in this qualitative analysis. The other thing that we found was that the leadership of the tech transfer offices themselves had, there was some commonality. The ones who had more experience, the ones who had some industry experience, who had entrepreneurial experience, in some ways, were more aligned with success. The other thing, of course, is infrastructure, right? And so infrastructure such as, funding, whether that's grant funding or equity funding, all these institutions had, good funds. For example, University of Florida, everybody knows, generates 20+ million a year off of their Gatorade license, and so that's allowed them to sort of consistently build, a commercialization process over a period of time. Similarly with Brigham Young University, BYU had a pretty big settlement with Pfizer around Celebrex, and that resulted in over $100 million. So their leadership, who was sort of focused and believed in it and provided funding. And then the last thing that is really important is the culture of the tech transfer team, particularly around sort of educating and coaching the faculty. So, Colin said the large metro areas have an advantage, but University of Florida, that's our top ranked large university for innovation, impact, productivity, is in Gainesville, Florida, which is not really a large metro. And how do they get around that? They get around that by doing a really good job of coaching their faculty on what it means to commercialize.
Provo, Utah is not very big either, and yet you have this Silicon Slopes area, the innovation ecosystem, very interconnected. Could I say one other thing on that issue as well? If there's one sentence that we wrote in the report that we think probably most sums up what we have to say in this report, it's the following: the institutions that have the greatest innovation impact are the ones which choose to do so. We don't suppose that every imaginable choice is available to every last university, but in general, the universities that score high, you can see a whole pattern of choosing to produce a lot of innovation impact in the way that we're talking about. One thing that was a result that was maybe a little surprising. So we looked at these variables that related to the technology transfer operation. It's not that surprising that a more sophisticated, larger, more experienced technology transfer operation might do a better job in terms of patenting or licensing. You would kind of expect that, right? But here's something that's cities that have relatively sophisticated technology transfer operations also score relatively high in producing high research impact through heavily cited papers that get cited in other people's patents. That it's not real obvious that a better technology transfer office would in itself produce more impactful research, and yet it does. Why might that be? We offer a couple thoughts on that. We can't really know. I mean, other than through the case studies that we did, these all are at least consistent with our story. Well, one possibility is that great innovative researchers actually care whether the university has an effective technology transfer operation, and that helps to choose where they choose to work. And Opus Faveo, before I was involved, did a survey of a number of universities, 90 plus some years ago, and absolutely we found that it was the same finding, that actually it turns out for recruiting great star faculty, it does matter whether you're doing a good job in this area of technology commercialization. A second possibility, and I think maybe it's even more profound, I happen to believe it's true, but we'd like to sort of really flesh this out, is the idea that the kind of university that produces a great technology transfer operation is also the kind of university that cares about its whole innovation ecosystem throughout. That it's in the culture, it's in the DNA, it's in the air and the water of the place. And so we think that, of course, it's important to get the technology transfer policies right, but it's probably even more important to get the culture from the top right.
It's great.
And I would add that it's not just about licensing or how many spinouts you create. It's about impact. What we're seeing is that they're good at impact, and we see. Granted, our index is skewed towards commercialization because it's a big component. You could argue, you could criticize it in that way. But when we talk to stakeholders, whether it was through our formal survey work or in lots and lots of individual conversations with people in tech transfer, on boards of trustees, political leaders interested in higher ed, what we keep seeing is the importance of tech transfer in accomplishing so many other objectives. Younger rockstar faculty want to be in a place where their research sees the light of day in some commercial way. And that may be a generational change. We actually would love to do an attitude survey about that. So if you're interested on your campus, we'd love to help out on that. But that's interesting. University boards of trustees and political leaders, especially for state universities who are involved in higher ed, want to see impact. And we can debate whether that impact, and it's a good debate, is that solving massive problems, societal problems like COVID, like cancer, or is it creating multi-million-dollar companies? You don't need to have, it doesn't need to be one or the other. It can be all of these. And yet, when you look at the tech transfer operation, it's interesting how that kind of ends up being at the nexus of so many of these questions. How do you attract sponsored research dollars? How do you attract or federal research dollars? How do you attract rockstar faculty? How do you attract great students in a very competitive student recruiting world? And how do you create jobs for all of these people? So I think for me personally, that's an interesting takeaway. And I think the research kind of showed that, especially some of this statistical research that tries to carve out some of that maybe bias of the tech transfer operation that at least Opus Faveo would have brought to the table initially.
Anita, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think, you know, we also did some additional analysis on the numbers, which didn't make it into our report. But, you know, we looked at what a university might be able to do to improve its ranking and what impact that might have on the economy. And so just, I'm looking at some numbers here. So if you look at the top quartile of large universities versus the bottom three quartiles. So the top quartile of large universities on average has research dollars of a little under 7 million annually. Sorry, the average is about 800 million annually. And then we looked at the license income as a percentage of research dollars of the top quartile on average versus the bottom three quartiles on average. And that is 10.4% versus 2.4%. So just understand that. So the spread between the top quartile in research, in license income as a percentage of research dollars from the top quartile to the bottom three quartiles is an 8% spread. And if we were able to, you know, if universities in the bottom three quartiles were able to sort of improve their outcomes and lower that spread from 8% to something smaller, it would have a big impact on the economy. And we've done some of these, you know, this analysis. We'll probably, you know, publish some of this, you know, as we go along. And we're also going to sort of encourage other researchers to use kind of the work we've done and the data sets we've created if they want to sort of dive into it and do additional analysis.
Yeah,
I have
and just
a question. Someone is asking for clarification. When you refer, Vinny, to patent citations, do you mean patents cited within the academic paper or patents cited by other patents or both?
It's patents cited by other patents.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And just to follow up on the point of this kind of quartile analysis, if you in one of these groups, large, medium, and small, if you are in the top quartile, terrific. That's great news. But if you were not, I would say the news is even better, because if you're not, just looking at large universities, so 57 of the largest universities, this is our top group. If one of the institutions, let's say a prototypical institution that is in the bottom three quartiles, so the average institution in the bottom three quartiles, if that entity could get to match the median of the top quartile, not the best in 5 years with some growth assumption, they could just get to be as good as the middle of the top quartile, median of the top quartile. That's an additional $36 million per year in license income, an additional 75 patents per year, and 11 spinouts per year. But I want to highlight that $36 million per year in license income. That's, you know, that's real dollars for a lot of universities.
Exactly.
Just coming up to an hour now. It's about 4 o'clock Eastern time. I'm in Boston as well. If there are other questions, please continue to add them into the question box and we'll take them. But in the meantime, I think it would be great just to hear from each of the panelists some observations about why the world needs to know this information.
Who wants to go first?
Colin, I'm sure you have views on this.
Yeah, I think from the point of view of the Bush Institute and me, I think I would say two things. Number one, going back to what I said early on, we really want the world to understand better how central great research institutions and the enterprise they're engaged in are to the future of our economy, to prosperity, to rising living standards, upward mobility for people who start from modest circumstances or disadvantage in our economy. It's so very central. The public doesn't understand that well enough. It gets very caught up in other kinds of noise and polarized discussion about education. There's so many other things that people tend to focus on. We really do need to focus on these core missions of teaching and research and the impact those are having in our economy and in our world. So that's one. And a second is the idea that as a society, institution by institution and overall, we really can do significantly better. The amount of innovation, technological progress that happens in a given year, say, it's not a fixed quantity. If one institution does better, that doesn't mean somebody else does worse. It is a pie that can be grown. It can be grown through intentional action, through running things better. We think our study shows that. In fact, as Christian was just saying, it shows it with some numbers, some real orders of magnitude. And so it seems pretty clear to us that what some would say is the frustratingly slow pace of economic growth in this country could actually be accelerated by intelligent investment in our whole research complex, the R&D of America, prominently including the universities of America, and through better returns per dollar, better bang for the buck. America can do better in this regard. No doubt countries all over the world can as well.
Christian, what would you say to that question? Oh, sorry, Vinny, did you want to go?
Sure, why not? So, this is the 75th anniversary, plus or minus a year or two, of Vannevar Bush's famous paper on science policy that sort of ended up creating some of the three-letter institutions we have now, such as NIH and NSF. And it's also the 40th year anniversary of the Bayh-Dole Act, which sort of gave ownership of patents that came out of federally funded research at universities to the universities. And the impact of both those policy reports have been dramatic. I think there's an opportunity for this generation now to come up with its own policy framework. And I think that this report is one of many that'll be needed to show our policymakers that focusing in on innovation at a federal level is important. And I think that's starting to be heard. So you're starting to see that all these agencies are increasingly putting funds into translation. Likewise, philanthropy and foundations are starting to put money into translation. And the net result of all that are accelerated paths to new drugs, new medical devices, digital therapies. And you can clearly see that in the pandemic response. While the pandemic response by the US has been lacking in public health, one could argue, just by the numbers, it is not lacking in research. So if you look at kind of the leading vaccine candidates, if you look at contact tracing, if you look at diagnostics, most of the leading opportunities to get us out of this pandemic are coming out of US universities and medical centers.
We have a question somewhat related to that. Did the team observe a correlation between student educational outcomes, i.e. retention rates, pursuit of graduate studies, and a high research productivity? And I think, you know, when you touched on the pandemic, I think that it's probably somewhat related to that.
So can I jump in on that one?
Sure, yes.
The one word answer is yes. I think when one brings up this whole area of commercialization and so on in a typical university setting, there is sometimes the concern that different priorities of the university might experience trade-offs, you know, that being better at some of the activities that we're talking about might in some sense take away from, say, the teaching mission. Our analysis of the data absolutely points in the other direction, that universities that are outperforming in terms of innovation impact, at least in the limited number of teaching measures that we looked at, are also outperforming there. Now, we could easily do more work on that. We could take this data set and relate it to lots more variables that relate to the teaching impact, the teaching side of the university. That could be an interesting sequel. We thought it wasn't the central theme, but what limited we did basically said that when you do a good job with maximizing innovation impact, you do a good job with teaching results as well. You also do a good job, by the way, with attracting the kinds of students that you want to attract. So it's comprehensively a win-win. We didn't find any negative trade-offs at all.
That's great. Christian, I'd love to hear what you think the world needs to know about this, but also we've got a question, which maybe you can also answer. Is this going to be an annual report?
Yeah, on that one, we would love for it to be an annual report. We have not committed to that, both of our organizations are pulled in a few different directions. So allocating resources is always an issue. If you like this report, I'd certainly ask you to let us know, or feel free to share it with organizations that might be interested in helping to sponsor it. We think it would be a very good report to update regularly. So again, we haven't committed to that. We'd love to, and we'd love to be connected to any kind of sponsorship partner as well. So we're open to ideas there. The other thing, I just before I give my observation, I just wanted to riff a little bit on the need statement. You know, again, I go back to all these conversations that we've had across the country, across the world with people, and you get into some kind of old war horse debates and arguments, the applied research versus basic research argument. And there's a lot of passion around that. It's certainly an interesting question, but I think what we see both anecdotally and then what this research shows is that if you're good at one, you can be good at the other. What we saw is that if you are good at this kind of applied translational aspect of stuff, you're also good at basic research. And that's interesting. And this is kind of from the Opus Faveo perspective, what we see is this opportunity to create alignment around the organizations. And there was a question that came in as well about how much can be improved. How much is this in the control of an institution? And for me, that's a really nice segue into my kind of concluding observations. The answer is, and I think Colin or somebody else already said it in the midst of some other comments, but I want to highlight it. The answer is yes. I think that's the really exciting part of all of this. We have wonderful institutions in this country, around the world as well, but let's just talk about the United States. Wonderful institutions, important institutions that are doing a terrific job. I know a lot of people on the call today are tech transfer professionals. You're doing a great job. We see that over and over again. Even if on the venture development side, we're negotiating over a license agreement, we can't step away from the fact that the tech transfer office is important and people are doing good work. But I think that the bigger takeaway for leadership in the organization is that tech transfer is a big component of creating impact. People are talking about it a lot. They're talking about innovation a lot, and that's political leaders, that's students who are trying to figure out where they're going to have jobs, and exciting, fun, cool, high-paying jobs. Faculty members, those rock stars who want to go to great places that are going to have exciting people and opportunities to create spin-out companies and so on. So you can definitely get better if you're in that top quartile. I'm talking to you, Drexel. I think we hope you rest a little bit on your laurels, but we think you could still be better, and that's I think a very positive story. And if you're not in the in the top quartile in your group, I think it's an even better story of, boy, more resources, more focus, getting this kind of report in front of your board, in front of your leadership. I think it ought to be really, really exciting for you as a tech transfer professional, and also for any other stakeholder here. I'll also just mention that there was another question here about whether we can do, whether we can include institutions that were not in the report, either because they don't report to Autumn or because their data to Autumn was incomplete. And the answer is yes. Certainly from Opus Faveo's perspective, we would be happy to do that, and happy to have a sideline conversation. Do reach out to us, and we can talk about that. We're also happy to have a broader conversation with the different stakeholders in your institution about the report, and kind of the broader, to coin a phrase, the broader impact, how the university can create more innovation impact from its activities. I didn't mention this in the beginning, but Opus Faveo has started tentatively at first, but we just continue to see the demand, so we are increasing it. We do have a strategy consulting practice that we have been building to address this question, and to help organizations, whether they're higher education institutions or governmental entities, or even private sector, but for the time being focused on academic and governmental sectors, looking at how to help organizations improve their innovation impact. And as I said, we think there's a lot that can be done, and it can be done in a way that actually pays for itself, because of a stat like the one I shared earlier, which is for that average bottom 3 quartile organization among top universities. And you don't even have to agree that license income is particularly important, but a project that could help you capture anything close to $36 million in additional license income per year, pretty interesting, I would think, to a board, to leadership, and the real impact is going to be in all the other stuff that comes with it, whether it's job creation, economic growth, regional economic development, or solving the COVID problem. Teresa, I do want to make sure that we kind of, maybe as a postlude here, that we talk about COVID as well, because I think there's some interesting takeaways there.
Absolutely.
Maybe we go around the room again on COVID, and that'll close us out.
It looks like Colin is ready to speak on it.
Yeah, well, first thing to say is there is I think everybody knows this more or less, there is a mobilization around development of vaccines as well as therapeutics for COVID, the like of which the world has never seen. What we typically read about is Pfizer, J&J, the biotech company Moderna, and so forth. All over the place, great research universities are integrally involved in this fight, and oftentimes very much either already invented the technologies that are now turning into sort of phase 2 trials for new vaccines and new therapeutics, or are actively involved in developing new ones today, very, very fast. Essentially, when the book is written on this episode, I think we'll find that the mobilization of university researchers on this project is something like the mobilization for defense research during World War II, a giant historic moment. It's just the story hasn't quite been told yet. We hope it ends very successfully, sooner rather than later. We also think that in the near term, when we talk about how to actually create, near to medium term, how do we create a durable economic recovery? And I'm an economist, so I like to think about that. I put to the group a very simple proposition. Humpty Dumpty is sort of fallen off the wall. We won't put it back together again. There is no return to the economic status quo pre-COVID. There is in some categories, obviously, but we all know that there's going to be lasting changes in terms of how some industries work. Whether it's bricks and mortar retail, work from home versus office, and countless other ways, right? Countless other ways. But we would make a very simple proposition, which is that knowledge-centric activities will grow as a share of the economy. The tech sector, the life science sector, and other knowledge-centric areas will come out of this a bigger percentage of the economy than before. We see this in terms of which stocks are outperforming by a long ways in the last few months. Universities will play a central role in that. They will, on the teaching side, train the people who make the growing part of the economy as the economy bounces back work. And they also, in many cases, will actually play an important role in the research, not just fighting COVID, but the research that becomes the new products, which will employ people and get unemployment back down to very low levels again over maybe 2 or 3 years. So universities are in the middle of that. Maybe they don't toot their own horn sometimes well enough, but they'll be more important than ever when it comes to creating prosperity over the next several years.
Anit, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I effectively did earlier. I'm sorry I'm moving my laptop around. I've never seen anything like this. My laptop is overheating, believe it or not, and shutting down. It's pretty warm here.
It's all
a lot of exciting ideas.
Yeah, exactly.
And anyways, yeah, I think Colin sort of captured it, as did Christian. I mean, there's no, people talk about eds and meds. Over the last 30 years, the metropolitan areas that have had a concentration of education and medical have outperformed other areas. Obviously, both those institutions are also under incredible economic threat right now. Every university in the country, I think, is taking losses in some form or the other. And, and are, in some ways, this is like, Detroit in the 80s. I mean, there's layoffs happening everywhere, but feel strongly that these institutions are going to come out of this pandemic even stronger than they were before. I can tell you with the institution that I'm most involved with Boston University, it is amazing how it has come together and, created this new concept of learn from anywhere. They're giving students an option of being residential versus remote. Research, which got stopped, is back going again. A lot of research actually didn't stop because you don't realize how much research is actually done in computers as opposed to on a bench. Even biological research, a lot of it is done in computers now. So I think this is a very interesting time. I think those universities that are very productive in the way they have a commercialization outcome are going to distance themselves from others if others don't, reform and try to catch up. And I hope they'll take a look at this report in detail, and it'll give them a roadmap of how to do it. And if they can't figure it out, Christian, I'm sure Opus Faveo can help them. So, that's my little commercial.
Great.
And I'll just, I guess, echo a little bit all of that. We, in thinking through COVID, we've actually done some scenario analysis of COVID outcomes with a panel that we put together, and we're issuing a series of papers on that. There's a lot of stuff like this out there. We're pretty focused on the innovation angle, but one of the fascinating things to us in that process has been really realizing what Colin and Vineet have said, which is that universities are central to getting us out of this mess, whether it is figuring out a vaccine or ventilator technologies or PPE, those very micro things or tactical things you might think of, or the more fungible, difficult questions of how do we relaunch our global economy? How do we relaunch local economies? Universities just are central to this. And so kudos to all of you. But the other thing here is that the chessboard has been knocked over. So if you are at the top of the heap, you ought to be watching your back. And if you're not at the top of the heap, this is your chance. So I know we have somebody from the University of Rochester online on the webinar. And boy, you know, this is an amazing opportunity for the Rochesters of the world who don't happen to be in Silicon Valley or inside 128 in Massachusetts. Because if you can use this to your advantage, if you can focus, and I know it's hard because of all the tactical problems of how do you get your students educated and how do you manage your staff remotely, lots of firefighting that has to go on. But if you can, in your organization, can look a little bit beyond that, it is a tremendous opportunity. So yeah, there's a little bit of a word of hope through all of this.
Awesome. I don't see any other questions, so I just would ask if people want to, if people want to download the survey after today, the full report, they can get it on the Opus Faveo website. And if anyone wants to get in touch with any of the authors, the Opus Faveo site would be the best place to go. Right, Christian?
I think so. And we're happy to route questions and so on to Colin or to the other authors as necessary. And I guess the other thing I'd say is if you have a group that you would like us to share this information with, we'd like to get it out there. It's certainly part of the mission of the Bush Institute. And from an Opus Faveo perspective, we are pretty heavily driven by the societal aspects of innovation and the work that we do. So we'd love to be able to get this message out to other audiences. So please do reach out to us.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank all of the authors that are on screen today and the others that Christian mentioned that contributed to this amazing report. And thank all of our participants for their attention and great questions. And we hope to be in touch with everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice summer, everybody.
Yep. Bye-bye.